My name is Morley Maier. I'm with Ruth Smith and a mutual friend of ours, Brian Beck. And we're just going to chat about what Ruth remembers about the time, her connection with the Yorkton Natural History Society. And I'm going to ask some questions, but as we go along, we'll just visit and see what we end up talking about. But my first question is, Ruth, and I wonder about this, what was your, how did you get involved? Why were you interested in the Yorkton Natural History Society?
I don't think I really was so much interested in the Natural History Society. I was a friend of, I was the best friend of Mrs. Priestley's daughter, Diana, who was same age as me. They moved to Yorkton about 1934, I think. And, you know, we were in public school, and we were friends all through high school. And Mrs. Priestley, of course, was Di's mother, and I was at their house a lot, and I think we, you know, we were interested in school and so on more than nature, but Mrs. Priestley was always interested in nature, and we thought that was just mother. She used to go around with binoculars, you know, looking at birds, and in fact, she often was up on the hill where Brian is living now, which at that time was just open prairie. And she would, in the wintertime, she would go out on snowshoes and up on the hill, which is the highest place in Yorkton, and look at the birds.
So, okay, so the war was on at that time.
Well, not when they came. No. War wasn't until 1939. She was. By then, Diana and I were through high school and going to business college. But I guess someone told me that or maybe she told me that she made a list of Saskatchewan birds, and quite a lot of people were interested in it. So maybe that's what made her decide to start the Blue Jay. Now, I don't know when the Blue Jay was first published. I can't remember the date.
Okay, I can remember the date. In fact, I have a copy of the very, very first Blue Jay, and it was in 1942.
1942, yeah.
That was the first one.
Well, I know my brother, Harvey Beck, and Stuart Houston were great friends. And they were just high school students then. They used to go out walking with her, looking at birds, and my brother was interested in insects. And I think there was a Mr. and Mrs. Foreman that used to go with them. I'm not sure about the name.
You're right. It's Mr. Foreman was the vice president of the Yorkton Natural History Society.
Well, they used to go out walking together, but Di and I didn't. At least I don't remember Di going. I know I didn't go. And then when Harvey, when Mrs. Priestley started the Blue Jay, she named it the Blue Jay because she used to read stories to the children when they were small that were quite well known in those days. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the author, but he used to write kids' stories about animals and birds that talked, and the Blue Jay was the one that carried the news around the forest.
That's a nice story.
Yeah, and so she named her paper the Blue Jay because it was going to carry the news around. And Harvey and Stuart used to color the cover. And I don't know who typed it. Maybe Mrs. Priestley did the first few issues, but and of course, because my brother was interested, when they started the Natural History Society, I joined, and I was a friend of the Shaws too, Cliff and Ruth Shaw. So it, automatically in 1942, I would enjoy it. I think maybe I was working in the city office at that time. I'm not sure whether I was there in 42 or 43, but I know we had regular meetings, and I don't know what else you'd like to know.
Well, I just have a question about, were you ever formally involved with the, in the production of the Blue Jay?
Yeah, later on. I wasn't on the executive for a while, but eventually I became I don't remember whether I was secretary treasurer or
I think you were.
or whether I was just secretary. But anyway, I took over from Pauline Summers.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know who was on it before that, but by then I guess I was getting more involved in it. And although the war was on, and we had lots of other things on our mind, but when I don't know who was typing the paper, whether it was Stuart or who, but anyway, Mrs. Priestley needed someone to type the Blue Jay, and the city clerk said I could go back to the office at night and run it off on the Gestetner, the old flag. So I used to type it on, they were sort of wax sheets.
I remember those.
Yeah,
I'm old enough.
Then I'd go back at night. I don't remember how many copies I ran off, but I ran them off, and then we stapled them together, and I don't know where we got the copy of the for the outside of the for the title page, but I don't remember how many I typed.
You know what? I'm going to look here because I was doing some reading, and I to be a member of the Yorkton Natural History Society when it started was 25 cents a year.
I don't know what the Blue Jay cost.
Yes, and I'm here in 1946. Now this is after Isabel's passing. Cliff Shaw was the president, became the president, and according to what I read, there were 335 copies of the Blue Jay that were mailed.
How many?
335.
I know.
I wrote that down because I think that's incredible.
Do you know that I even got a letter from the British Museum saying that where was the Blue Jay? The copy had been late.
Oh,
and I said to Mrs. Priestley, it goes to the British Museum, and she said, oh, yes.
Well, that number to me was just startling because it's
well, I know I used to turn that handle for an awful long time.
You would have to.
And I don't know how many of us stapled it, did the stapling fast, and then I'm kind of vague on that because there was a lot going on with the war,
okay, so what about Isabel?
Oh, she was an amazing person. She was very, very interested in the city. When she first came to Yorkton, a lot, people were still on relief. It was right in the middle of the Depression. And she worked there as a volunteer, I presume. I know she said Di and I out knocking door to door to selling carnations for Mother's Day for 10 cents each. You wouldn't remember people wearing carnations for Mother's Day.
I sort of do, but
yeah,
not,
they
yes.
wore pink one if Mother was alive and a white one if they were dead. Well, we went knocking from door to door, and I guess a lot of other people did too, collecting 10 cents. And then I remember helping Mrs. Priestley roll the money up, to go to the bank. And then they used it for relief for the hard-up people. So she was interested in the city, and she was very well educated. She had a university degree in botany, I think.
I think you're right, yes.
And I don't know what university she went to, but she was one of the first friends I had that was well-educated woman, because it was not common for women to go to university in those days. We had teachers that had degrees, but I wasn't close friends with them. And Mrs. Priestley meant a tremendous amount to me. Her daughter joined the Wrens, I guess it was, and she wasn't home anymore, so when I used to see Mrs. Priestley a lot, I'd go over and visit with her, and I always think of her more as a personal friend than somebody that was interested in nature, but I know I got interested in wildflowers, and she helped me. She showed me how to make posters and how to properly mount them and label them and everything, the way you're supposed to. I had quite a collection at one time. And she worked, I don't know whether it was volunteer or whether she was paid for the Ducks Unlimited, doing a survey on what plants were coming back as the drought left, because the drought was beginning to go away and the water was starting to come back. York Lake was almost empty during the dry years, and she was doing surveys for them. I don't know whether it was a paid job or not.
I remember reading something about that, and so your memory is very accurate when you talk about some of the things that Mrs. Priestley did.
Yeah.
Okay, but there's a sad part to the Mrs. Priestley story, and that was her sudden passing. When Mrs. Priestley passed away, that was a sad day.
Oh, that was terrible. I think it was Easter, and I think the war was just, was over, and Diana and Frank were home, I'm pretty sure. Diana was anyway. I don't know what they were doing, whether they were still in the army or whether they'd been demobbed, and she had, I had gone up on the hill where Brian lives now and had picked crocuses. We used to call it Crocus Hill. And I took her some crocuses. And she said she had this terrible headache she'd had for several days. And she'd been to the eye doctor, and he said there was nothing wrong with her. And she'd been to the doctor, and he said, take aspirin. And she was not feeling really well. Anyway, the night that she died, she phoned me and the kids had left. And she said, my headache has got better. It's suddenly gone. And I thought, well, maybe it was stress, you know, from having all the family home. And she said, we'll meet tomorrow and start working on the new Blue Jay. And she died during the night. And nowadays, of course, if you had a bad headache like that, they'd suspect a stroke right away, but they didn't in those days. And then her son, the little one, Michael, lived with us after she died until the end of August, maybe the beginning of September. And then his dad arranged for him to go to a boarding school in Winnipeg. But
So how old was Michael?
you know, I've been trying to think. I think he must have been about 12, but I'm not sure. He was still going to public school anyway.
Okay.
He wasn't in high school yet. He might have been 12 or 13. Can't remember how much younger he was than Diana, but there was quite a difference between them.
So Isabel was not very old.
I don't know how old she was. She couldn't have been, no.
I think she would have been in her 50s, I
Yeah.
think. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
She'd be about the same age as my mother.
Right.
Yeah. And they were friends too. And they were both English war brides. My mother married my dad during World War I, or just after World War I, and I guess Mrs. Priestley got married during the war because Frank was older than Diane.
Okay. You know what? That was, thanks for sharing that with us. That was very nice to hear. I mean, you read about these things, but having you be able to tell us when we know that you were there is much, much better.
Yeah. I remember once, I didn't know much about birds. I remember she was going to be camping at Madge Lake, and we used to camp there too. And I said, well, there's no birds there except ducks and loons and crows. And I remember her laughing. And then I stayed with her. She and Diana were camping there, and Michael. And I stayed with them for a week. And I can remember Mrs. Priestley standing in the middle of a slough, surrounded by mosquitoes, looking at a bird through her binoculars, and Di and I laughing. One of my favorite memories of her.
Oh my. Okay, so what about some of the other people? Do you have memories of, Stuart Houston, for example, or I mean, I don't know where I read this, and I might be making it up, but did Farley Mowat ever come to Yorkton?
No, I can't tell you that.
Okay.
I honestly don't know.
For some reason, I have that in my head. I might have made that up.
Yeah, I don't remember. Because he was overseas during the war, so unlikely he would have been. I don't know how long he was overseas, but I know he served overseas. And I remember somebody coming who raised bees and talking about raising bees. I don't know why that stuck in my mind, but I remember that.
No, I don't know.
I really don't remember too much about what we actually did at the meetings, but I know I went.
Well, maybe you were young and you weren't paying attention.
No, I had other things on my mind during the war.
Yes, Okay, do you know what? Just a couple more things. Are there any other fond memories that you have of that time? Things that you might want to share with us?
Well, it was a friendship. You don't think of it as any special things. I was engaged to be married, and Mrs. Priestley gave me some dish towels for a gift, and I still have them. And it was more of a friendship than thinking about nature all the time. But she was always interested in the nature. And I remember, that she used to go out in snowshoes in the winter, and that she was out looking at birds all the time in the summer. And one memory, I remember that I had never seen waxwings. I don't know whether they were just moving into this part of the country, but in front of the high school, there was a tree full of waxwings, and Diana and I were fascinated. They're so pretty. And I remember asking Mrs. Priestley what they were, and of course she knew right away. And that's the first time I remember seeing waxwings. And I know that she told me the mountain bluebirds were appearing in Saskatchewan, and they hadn't been before, and she was interested in that.
Anyway.
And I think I don't know whether the Guns were members of the Natural History Society or not. Joyce and her mother. She was Joyce Sanaka later on.
I'm sure they were.
I know they used to take part in the bird account, and I remember. I don't know what year it was, but there was an eclipse of the sun, and the best place in the world, or in Canada, to watch it was Bredenberry, I think. And I remember us getting up about 5 o'clock in the morning and driving there, and waiting for the eclipse of the sun. Everything got dark. The birds stopped singing. It was just for about 5 or 10 seconds. It was dark.
I've never experienced that, but I've heard other people describe what you're telling me, and it's kind of almost a weird, eerie sort of a
It was summer, and the birds were sort of singing, and then all of a sudden there wasn't a sound, and it was dark, and I suppose I was taking part in it because of Mrs. Priestley, probably. I don't know whether she was in the car with us, but I remember going out there.
Do you know what? I think unless there's something else you would like to tell us, I'm just going to say thank you for allowing us to come here and to talk to you.
I like to look back.
Yeah. And just to say one more time that, Mrs. Priestley was a pretty interesting and amazing person.
She was.
You knew that.
She was absolutely charming and kind and interested in Di and I, what we were doing in high school, and we could go and talk to her about what we were reading or doing in high school. She was a wonderful friend. I missed her terribly when she died.
And so, she started something that continues today, something that's still very, very...
she'd be amazed at the beautiful blue jay that comes out now.
What a wonderful thing she did, and what a wonderful thing you did in helping her with that. And so I thank you for letting us come and talk to you today. And I want to remind you one more time that there are not very many people, maybe nobody else, that would be able to tell us those life experiences that you had knowing Mrs. Priestley and at the very, very beginning of what now is the Saskatchewan Natural History Society. So very, very fortunate to be able to come and see you. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I just remembered I typed one of the blue jays, and I didn't know anything about birds, and I typed something about a ruffled grouse, and it was supposed to be a ruffed grouse, and she had to put an apology in the next blue jay.
Oh, no.
Typing area.
Anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to turn this tape off now, and that doesn't mean we still can't visit.